Okay, let's get started then. Everybody loves a good recovering porn addict story. I love the idea of this podcast being that you can never have too much good material talking about the dangers of pornography for the modern man. I think it's a very tough situation for guys of our age to be in. How much am I? 10 years older than you? Maybe a little less.
I think so. Hutch is like 10 exactly.
Okay, so I'm maybe like 8 or 9 years older. So we've both grown up with the internet around us all the time, and that has made pornography quite a scary thing. So I guess we'll get into it. I'm going to give like a 10,000 foot view of my life and how pornography and I have intersected, and then what that's taught me and how I can hope to be of help to anyone who watches this, or friends of mine that call, and anyone I can help. So all right, let's get started. So I grew up in a pretty loving house, which is a lot of fun. However, like a lot of people with kind of difficulty with sexuality, I did have some, I guess what you'd call like childhood trauma. I won't get into all the details, but I got introduced to sexual stuff pretty early in life, which is tough. Most of the statistics I've read is a lot of people that deal with addictions in the sexual realm get introduced to things far earlier than the average, but I think the last time I read the average introduction to pornography I read it was 11 years old a couple of years ago, and it may be down even lower than that now.
I read something, maybe it was even like 8 or 9.
8 or 9, yeah. And that's bad because your brain is not capable of handling that level of dopamine or that level of visceral stimulation.
Yeah.
So, and I was not ready to handle that. I was probably like mid-elementary school when I first saw pornography outside of other sexual stuff, and was pretty hooked. The shame of it is pretty brutal. Like when you're a little kid and you don't particularly know how to handle those things, and you discover growing up like in the evangelical world that sex outside of marriage is not right, but you've already been dabbling in that because you're a kid and you're not sure what's better, or you're not sure what you're doing at all, but you realize, I've been doing something bad for a while. I'm sure there are some kids out there that are like, I can handle that and can talk to my parents about it. I was not one of them. I internalized that as like, okay, I've been doing a bad thing, so that means I'm real bad, which is not correct. We'll get to that eventually, but very understandable when people take that direction.
Yeah.
So I became very secretive, which secrecy fuels shame, which fuels not liking yourself, which fuels the desire to make yourself feel better, which fuels the desire to watch more pornography.
Yeah.
And so then I just spiraled on that for most of my growing up life. It really came to a head in college, because turns out when you are struggling with sin and you start getting close to other people, it will also start to ruin their days as well as yours. So even if you're doing a lot of fighting on the inside, it can get messy. So I got married to my girlfriend in college, and all of my, the fact that I had this secret addiction came out. I didn't really know I was an addict. I think I was so numb to my problems. Like I was like, okay, I have a problem with sex, but like I think I can control it. Turns out I couldn't control it. But I, like a lot of guys, thought, well, maybe I should get married. Like that will fix it. I think it's a very big misunderstanding for men, is that having sex and getting married doesn't necessarily fix your problems with sexual sin. I've got a whole thing we can talk about later. This theory I run with, that most people have two sexuality. I think a lot of men specifically that struggle with sexual sin. You've got one that's good that you don't really recognize until you get married and start having sex within the right context. And you've got this other one that's fueled a lot by sin. And because I had spent my whole life looking at pornography and struggling with shame and secrecy, I had this monster of a bad sexuality. And so when I started trying to develop a good sexuality with my wife, it just paled in comparison to like this beast I had to kill. And so I just didn't know that was a thing. I ended up relapsing and starting using pornography again after I got married. Eventually, my wife caught me in it. Our relationship got very complicated very quickly. She ended up leaving me, which was tough, like very brutal. To be like barely married, still in college, still felt like a baby, like not really capable of handling all the things, because I think I was pretty emotionally stunted from years of pornography use, and that had just really set me back as far as emotional health and mental health. So when you get thrown a really bad thing in life, there's a couple of options. You can either just melt down into a person and just kind of turn into a puddle, or you can try your best to claw out of it. And so I said, well, let's try my best to claw out of it. And God was good and organized a lot of really good people in my life at that point. I started going to a couple different groups, which we'll talk about, like tips and tricks as far as trying to get healthy. Getting with other people and getting connections with people is going to be super essential. So I started doing all that stuff. I started going to counseling. I started meeting with groups, both anonymous and like named groups, and doing book studies. And over the course of the next couple of years, was able to kind of right the ship, deal with the things I had grown up with that I didn't understand, and learn to start changing my behaviors to fit this kind of new life and heart change that I'd had. That took a while to dig through. Eventually we got to the point where I was like, okay, cool. I'm like a relatively normal human being now. Or I don't know what relatively normal is, but a human being who can understand where he's come from and can put things together, and can recognize how God moves through things, good and bad, to make our lives happen. And we'll talk a little bit more about all those details eventually. Now I am remarried to another wonderful wife. We've got one beautiful baby girl and another little boy on the way. And life's really good. God has been far nicer to me than I ever deserved for someone who hid in sin and tried to hide from him for so long. So he's been really, really good to me. That's probably the like big view of like, that's how I got here. I'm almost 30. I would now in hindsight, I'm like, I was a hardcore pornography addict from probably 10 till 24. I guess 22 is when it all came out.
Okay.
I struggled a lot after getting divorced. So like mid 20s, I was still kind of wrestling with it.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So
Do you think that made it worse?
Yeah. Well, when everything first came out, I had actually the longest period of sobriety I had for a long time was over a year. And that was when everything was getting really bad. Cause at that point you're just like white knuckling. And it's like, if I can be good enough, maybe my wife will stay and not leave me. That's not very good. That's not a good mindset or way to be at. And it's not really how things happen. People can decide to do whatever they want, regardless of your actions. But I knew the only thing I can control was what I did. And so I was able to stay clean for over a year. Once she left and things started calming back down, I got a lot more lax as far as how aggressive I was fighting against pornography, because I wasn't married anymore. I didn't feel like it mattered as much, even though it did.
Yeah.
Let me see. I got married a couple of years ago, and, we'll talk too about how, the bear with addiction is that like, because you changed your brain chemistry, like, I'm going to say like I have victory over it in the sense of I'm much better than I used to be, but it's still a struggle. And so how long have I been clean now? I think my last relapse was like a year or two ago. It's been long enough that it's like, I struggle to remember when it was.
Yeah. That's good.
Which is good. Yeah, that's a good spot to be in. But it's one of those things you still wrestle with.
Right.
Jason Isbell has this song called It Gets Easier, and he was an alcoholic and a drug addict, and the chorus goes, it gets easier, but it never gets easy. And it's every time I listen to that song, I feel heard and seen in that song. I'm like, yeah, that's very true. It's like, it is easier now than it was when I was 13, and it's easier now than it was when I was 21. It's still not easy. I've talked with some older guys because I've been in groups with guys of all different ages. Some of the really old guys say like eventually your sexual drive falls off, and so some of that gets a little bit easier. But I'm like, all right, so when I'm 80, maybe it'll be a little easier. Right. But I got a lot of time between now and then, so I got to learn how to do some stuff. I think a really weird thing with porn use is how we lie to ourselves and say it's not hurting anyone else. It's easier to lie to yourself about that. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that the porn industry and sex trafficking are involved, and I think it rots us from the inside. So even though we think we're not hurting anyone, we're hurting ourselves. And then all the people that are involved with it. It gets hard to avoid that when you get married to somebody, because especially in the context of a marriage, like sexual intimacy is this treasured thing that's only supposed to be for the two of you. And so even if you are using porn for a very variety of reasons, it is picking something over your spouse, which is not great. Yeah. And a pretty big breach of trust. When it all kind of comes out of nowhere, it really hits like a bomb. So with my first wife, she had her own kind of history of issues. And so me kind of breaking her trust ignited a lot of that. I think that's what made her decide to leave. She just couldn't come to forgive me and just felt like that was it. I can't say much more than that. But I got it from the sense of like, oh man, I really dropped this bomb on her because I didn't even know my problem was this bad. It took me like relapsing inside of marriage to be like, oh, okay, like nothing that I've done will fix me. I must I have a problem. Like I can tell now finally after years of ignoring that I had a problem. Like, oh, it's definitely there. Yeah. Versus it's way easier with Helen of like being someone who is pursuing health and trying to understand my brain and what makes me to go to her like when we were engaged and be like, hey, like this is a thing for me. Like this is part of my life. If you don't want to get married to me, that's cool. because of this as like a sin pattern, like because I'm an addict. I think most addicts, I would hope, folks that are in recovery, like would tell that to their significant other, because whether or not you look at porn or do drugs or drink alcohol, like that's a big breach of trust, and it's a lot for your spouse to wrangle with. So it was nice to be on the front end to be able to talk to her about it. Obviously, when relapses happen, they're always hard. They're way harder on your wife than they are on you.
How would you suggest to handle that? Like that conversation, like I know there's probably a lot of guys out there who like struggle with this in their relationship, in a marriage, and like would you go about it? How did you go about it? And what would you suggest to men, like through what you understand, like to handle it?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things you can do to help yourself is to have guys around you who your sin doesn't directly affect, because they will be the best sounding board to practice these sorts of conversations and talk about. So like I've got my best friend. He was the best man at my wedding. We've been known each other for years. I love my wife a lot, but if something happens bad to me, he's the first guy I'm calling. Because from one guy to another, I can tell him like, your main instinct is going to be to cover your sin. Like, I think that happens for anyone, especially for addicts, especially like for me who struggles so much with shame. Yeah. It's like my goal is to, like, I want to make me look as good as possible, even though I've done something bad. And so if I talk to Helen straight away, even if she is the best woman in the world, who's just asking genuine questions, my brain is going to read that as she's trying to find something bad that I've done so she can, like, so I can be in trouble. Which that's like nothing on her. That's all my sin and my, like, the devil lying to me. Right. But I'm like, I don't think I can handle that in that situation. I've learned enough about myself and been in enough of those situations. It's like, I'm not strong enough to handle that. So what I need to do is call my buddy, who I can say, hey, this is exactly what happened, like blah, 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 blah. And I know I need to tell Helen, but I just had to tell you first, because I know with my buddy, he is going to say he loves me, like no matter what, because he and I have both had a lot of struggles and we both shared a time with each other. And it's like, there's just no judgment there. I mean, there is judgment in the sense of you want guys that care about your Christian heart and say, you don't need to do that. Like, how can we help you stay better than that? Right.
It's like a constructive kind of judgment.
But not a, like, dunk on you, you suck judgment. Right. And not that Helen gives me that anyway, which is why she's a wonderful wife and is very gracious to me. But it's super essential for me to have that group, that guy. And then I've got a couple other guys too that I will ping those things off of. Or like if I'm really struggling, sometimes it's tough to talk to Helen about it. If it's not like a, hey, I'm close to relapsing, but I'm just thinking about these things more. Because sometimes, like, if you are married to someone who's not an addict, they don't quite get it. Right. Which is great. Like, I'm super happy that other people's brains aren't like mine, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm just I'm on the hook for dopamine. And if I find something that's a little drip, like, I'll just keep doing it. Yeah. Even if I know I shouldn't. I think all humans struggle with that, but I think for addicts, it's a little tougher. So it's good to have people that have been down that same road. And so just like I can talk to some guys that I was in a group with years ago, and they're just like, I get it. Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. And they can help you make a better plan. Yeah. And then you go to your wife. I think all the guys I've counseled in areas like this, like, if I could plan the perfect, like, confession of sin to someone, either a group of people you love really closely or your spouse, usually it's a spouse, because that's where this, the rubber meets the road with this. It would be like, you don't want it to come out in bits and pieces, like, because it's breaking trust and you want to just get it all out in one go. So it's best if you can talk to people beforehand and, like, think about what you've done and try to structure it in the best way. Not because you're trying to lie or make yourself look the best, but because you've worked through it with some people and have a plan to try to change your life for the better.
I think that's really important for men to have that to, like, fall onto. And, I know some men probably don't have that, and they're in this situation. Is there any pointers that you could give to men? If you didn't have that buddy, what could you do in that situation if you didn't have somebody to fall onto?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of good options, like things that were really helpful for me for healing as I was piecing things together, that I think would be good for anyone. First, if you don't have anyone that like the places I went to, one, I had friends, so I was always able to lean on them, but sometimes it's good to have people that you don't know. Big fan of counseling. Like, I would say definitely for Christians, it would be good to see a Christian counselor. I've seen counselors on both the secular and Christian point of view. It makes more sense to be talking to a counselor who's from your same worldview, because they can help you kind of feel some stuff. Like, especially talking about pornography, like some secular counselors are like, pornography's fine. And so it's not going to work well if I think this is a problem in my life and they don't think it's a problem.
Right. Yeah. So that makes sense.
Counseling is good because you pay someone money to sit across the room from you and you can just tell them anything and they're not going to tell anyone. So that's great. Yeah. And so if it's like, I don't have a friend I can tell because I'm worried my friends are all like, or, something may happen and it disrupts my friend group or whatever, like, just go see this other person and you give them money and they say, cool. And they'll give you you some advice, and it's great. And so if they're a Christian counselor, they should be forming that out of the gospel, which is kind of the key. Is just, not just how do we change your behavior, but how do we change your heart?
Yeah.
So that's great. There are also a bunch of anonymous groups. Like there's Alcoholics Anonymous, there's Sexaholics Anonymous, which is SA. There's Samson and the Pirate Gangs is another group of like anonymous people. Obviously, it's best to go to a anonymous group that fits with your addiction, but if there's not one for your specific thing, like I think it's good to just go to any of them. I spent probably 2 years going through the steps and meeting with people. I've since life's changed and I've gotten busier, and so I haven't stayed plugged in with a sponsor and things like that, as I've kind of built my own support network.
Yeah.
But it was super great to get together with people, like, because it's anonymous, and some of the folks in there like have way more impactful stories than me, just in the sense of like the things they've done and how good God has been to them. It's the most humbling room I've ever been in, is to hang out with a bunch of people who are all in the same boat of like, I'm an addict and I'm real broken and I'm here because I want to be better. And so some of that's really awkward when it's with people and trying to break down those barriers between people. But an anonymous group, everybody is there. The folks that have been there for a long time, like they do a very good job leading the way of like, we're just throwing off our load and talking with each other. Like, set everything down outside the door and come in and just bare your soul. And it's really good. So if you don't have anyone to talk to, I would find a group. Groups are great. Counselors are great. But obviously having friends that are near you and know you is ideal. For anyone who watches this, like most of the books you read about sex addictions hurting marriages, I've discovered I'm in a weird spot because most of the books are like, I used porn and then I came clean to my wife and we stayed together and now our marriage is awesome. Like most of them are happy endings, which is good. It's my genuine goal for anyone who is stuck in sexual sin, is that if you're married, is that you tell your wife and you guys figure out a plan and you reconcile, and it's beautiful. But that did not happen for me, and getting divorced sucks. It's really hard. So if I can be a voice like kind of on the counter side of like, it should be a good ending. Every book I've ever read is a happy ending. I've never read a book where it's like, I came clean and then my wife left me and it sucked.
Yeah.
But that's my story. And God is still so good in that. And I would not have traded that for the world. Like my life is incredible now, and I would go through it again. I would go through it again a million times to see how God has treated me and changed me through that.
Yeah. And from what I kind of understand from your story, from what I've heard, is you fought really hard, for that first marriage. And it's like,
absolutely.
What are the steps that you like went through? And like, I know it didn't work out, but like from what I understand, you just tried really hard to, keep things together and just do the right thing. Could you kind of like walk us through that and like how you felt through that and like what because I'm sure you sacrificed a lot too. I'm sure it was really hard to go through that. So just kind of walking through what that looked like, and maybe help other guys understand kind of like what it looks like to just kind of like try to mend things, do your best.
Yeah. I think to summarize it all, because I'll feed it into like something I wanted to talk about tonight, was like taking responsibility for the things you do in your life is super important.
Yeah.
And I want to talk more about that, because I think that's how you not cure yourself of addiction, but that's how you learn to fight bad habits, is learning that God calls us to be responsible. And that actually, while responsibility seems really hard, and most of the modern world tells us and feeds us this pleasant life of doing nothing, and that's what porn feeds us to, is like you do nothing and you get all the benefit, that actually you'll be happier and more fulfilled if you take responsibility and do stuff. Yeah. And so a lot of what it looked like in my first marriage was like a crash course on taking responsibility, because I had just kind of flitted through life. And so when it's like you hit this wall and you're just looking around like, what have I been doing? It's a lot of like, if you've broken trust with somebody, they're going to make a lot of demands of like, I want you to change this and this and this and this, and you just got to do it. Usually in the case of a healthy marriage with at least one emotionally healthy partner, like those demands are not extreme. And so it's pretty easy to like, oh yeah, I'm obviously going to stop watching pornography. I'll change some habits. I'll do this and that. In my case, since there was a little bit of extra stuff going on underneath the surface for her, some of the demands got pretty extreme by the end. So I bent as much as I could backwards to do all of those things. And I think I did a pretty good job of doing them all. It was a lot of changing my behavior. I didn't do very much for a year. I was basically under house arrest, like just kind of hanging out and making sure I wasn't getting close to anything, doing a lot of study, doing a lot of very dedicated effort internally to change how I thought about things. Yeah.
So you were just taking a lot of like self-improvement kind of time, like just trying to figure out how to heal. And...
Yeah, a lot of reading books, a lot of going to groups, a lot of going to counseling, a lot of that. And so that was good in the long run. My hope was that it was going to feed into a reconciliation because we had separated in the middle of all that. We'd stay together, try to make it work. We ended up separating. My hope was that that was going to lead to a reconciliation of like, hey, I've done all this work. I think I'm a lot healthier. Like I would love to stay married. We got together to talk about it. She opted out of reconciling. And so she decided to file. I wish she hadn't because I think that was the wrong move morally, but it's weird. It's a very weird spot to be in my brain of like, I'm happy that happened because my life is great now. Like I live in this cool house with a fireplace and a baby, and like my life would look very different, I think, if we'd stayed together. So I'm happy, but I'm also sad because that was like, I think there was some sin in that and a lot of sin wrapped up in that. And a lot of it was learning to break down my defensiveness about my sin and about myself as a person. Because when you've done something wrong, like taking responsibility for it is, I think, in a certain way, being able to say, I did do this thing wrong. It doesn't make me wrong as a person, but you got to be able to own up to something you've screwed up.
Yeah.
And understand that doesn't make you the worst person in the world. I think I struggled with that for a long time because I think that all fed back to me as a kid being like, I've done this bad thing, therefore I am bad. Yeah. Which is not the case, but it's very hard to overcome those walls you build in your brain as a kid.
Right. Cool. Well, yeah, let's dive into like the responsibility taking. Yeah, I just want to kind of dive into what you had to say in your experience with like just taking responsibility, what that did for you, what that did for your relationships with your family and the Lord and all that. So.
Yeah, it's super important. So obviously we're both believers, so we're going to be framing this from a perspective of God calls us to a certain standard of rules and doing things, and we believe that human beings are sinful, and so a lot of our base urges are to not do the things God wants us to do because we want to be selfish, but God calls us to serve others. I think that is the most sensible thing as far as thinking about responsibility. Like it all feeds into the Christian worldview really well, but I do think it fits in a couple of other ways, like for non-Christian worldview, like guys that feel like something's off. Like I think that's the Spirit nudging them. Like I think all of us being humans, like we carry we're images of God and like image bearers of the Lord. And so I think that our consciences speak to us a little bit and just how God wants us to. Our consciences speak God's law to us. It's written on our hearts. And so we oftentimes will want to do the right thing even though we don't quite know why. So I think that's some of that in play. But I also think taking responsibility is good for society. So if you're not someone who's a Christian, you're like, well, why the heck would I do that if I don't believe in this antiquated set of books from Palestine 2,000 years ago? It's like, well, it's also good for everybody if people take responsibility for their actions. So there's that. I think about it like there's this whole idea of the manosphere of like these content creators that are dudes who are like, you should just make money and
like really red pilled.
And bang women and like use surrogates instead of like getting married. And like, that's a little aggressive.
It's really tense.
Yeah. I'm like, I don't think that's what taking responsibility looks like.
Yeah. Doubling down on the other side.
Yeah. Where it's like, you really take charge of your life and you control everybody and you're just the lone wolf who's on top of things. Like, I don't think that's right. And I also don't think living like a man is being really passive. And I think modern society is grooming men to be super passive. I was super passive. I tell most folks when I meet with them about stuff like this that I don't feel like I became a human being until like the middle of college when all of this stuff started coming out. Because as I look back, I'm like, man, there was so much stuff. Like I wasted so much of my life when I could have been doing stuff because I was just like playing video games and watching porn. Not that porn's bad. Not that playing video games is bad necessarily, but it does help. Like those things together and just living in the age of the internet can really sap all of our desire to do stuff.
Yeah. And that's hard because we're kind of in like this newer area of like, all this technology coming in so quick. We're just thrown into this culture where things are hitting us really quickly. And so it's just like, our culture definitely had a huge impact on us. And there is like blame to be put on culture, but also you just got to take responsibility for like, you did fall into that. You can take the responsibility now to like get yourself out of it. You can pick yourself up, or help like call on the Lord and be like, Lord, like just talk to him and get him to help you, out of it. Cause I think that makes it 10 times easier. Just being able to like call on the Lord and ask for his strength.
Yeah. When I think about responsibility, I think of a lot of, I think a lot about hunger and food, like as a metaphor for it. Because a lot of the instincts I think that drive people are appetites. And I think sin and addiction are appetites that run out of control. When I was getting healthy, I was meeting with a lot of people and I started doing fasting. I don't fast a ton anymore, but I started working on it. Out of the idea of basically like if you can train your body to be hungry, like you can master this appetite, you can also master other appetites.
Yeah.
Much like lust is the appetite for physical pleasure run out of control. Much like selfishness is the appetite for being the center of attention run out of control. Like it's these things that we want that are normal, good human things, and we just let them run wild.
Yeah. I think that's cool because like when I started getting away from it, I noticed like that was such a big like appetite, like such a big hunger. And then once that was stripped from my life, there's other things that I've been able to have more control over, more discipline with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important. I've discovered I like Stoic philosophy, which is very like trad man of me, of like getting into like Marcus Aurelius, like dudes that were just like, hey, you gotta like do some stuff and start working on some things in your life, and then eventually that feeds out. I always think of Jordan Peterson, he's like one of the ministry guys. I haven't listened to him enough to really have a definitive opinion on him.
I love that guy.
But I love the make your bed thing where he's like, you got to start making your bed, and then that feeds out. Like I think it is. Sometimes it's as simple as that. Obviously, it takes time and dedication to do anything. But just the idea of you have to temper yourself. Like you are a potentially runaway thing where your appetite for whatever can really overwhelm you, whether it be it food or pleasure or time by yourself or being with friends or alcohol. Like any of these things can become an idol. And so when Christians talk about idols, it's just a thing that you've put over God in your life. Like God has set this line of rules. It's like, this is the good thing that we should be striving for. And if we take anything and kick those out and say, well, actually, this is what I want to do more. That's what we call an idol. And an idol is just anything that we put up there that can run away.
Yeah.
And an essential part of taking responsibility is learning to temper your urges and control yourself. Because if you can control yourself, you can do a lot more cool things. Like I can do a lot more cool stuff now with my life. Like I have children and these little like joyous, like my daughter's a year and a half old. So she comes up like here and she runs around and is snotty and laughs and like talks and babbles. And it's like, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I would never have done this if I had just kept watching pornography. Like I would have just wallowed. Like I went to veterinary school. I'm a veterinarian now. Like I'm a doctor. I take care of animals. It's a super awesome field. I'm married. I'm in a great church. Like I have friends and this super fulfilling life. That's just like, I can look around and see a ton of good things. It's super great. And it's like how I would not nearly be as productive for society, if you want to look at it from a secular view. And from a personal view, I would not be nearly as fulfilled if I had just kept wallowing in my own whatever I wanted.
Yeah.
And actually taking charge, or not even taking charge, but just like learning to temper my desire and start setting goals and directing towards those was super important. And like that's changed my life.
Yeah. So when you stopped, you noticed like things were changing, like you were being more productive. Like what did that timeline look like? It's interesting. I like to talk kind of about like replacing the habit, because you can't just like get rid of it and then be done with it. You kind of just have to replace it. And obviously like it's a given in your life that you've been able to replace it. And with things like you've pursued an awesome job and you have an awesome family and like you have a child and an awesome wife. And it's like, can we just kind of talk about like, well, one, how fulfilling that has been in your life and how that's changed that, and like and back to the other thing, just like the timeline of like what that looked like, how quickly did things change for you when you gave
absolutely. So for me, it kind of came in two phases. The first was like as a recently divorced guy, and now as a married guy, or like a remarried guy, because they're like the activities I do are different, but the mindset behind them is really the same. So like as a recently divorced guy, there were a few things, like I was going to groups to fill that time. I was going to counseling. I was filling that time. I got really into the gym. I don't have muscles anymore. Not that I really ever grew that big of muscles, but like I went to the gym hard for a couple of years. And that was really helpful for me. Like in part of the like training your physical urges, like I played sports growing up, but I was never like, I always wanted to avoid physical labor. And so I was like not really a workout guy.
Yeah.
But turns out if you have a lot of bad voices in your head, you can go lift a heavy thing until they go away and then you feel better. It's like, wow, this is incredible. You can give yourself dopamine through other pathways rather than being on the internet and just like blue lighting until 3 a.m. It's like, oh no, wait, I can just go to the gym and lift and feel a lot better.
Yeah.
So I did that a lot, in the immediate post-divorce period.
Okay.
And that was super essential for me, like helping channel those physical urges into, rather than I want to go act out sexually, I want to go to the gym and channel this into something that's productive for me.
Gym seems like kind of like a consistent thing that guys will say, like, really helped them out. Would you say like that was like one of the main things? I mean, obviously, Lord, and then, gym, but like you had gym, and then was there anything else, or was like gym really dominant in helping you kind of get that energy?
Gym was pretty dominant for me. The other things were like groups. So like going and meeting with other guys who were struggling.
Okay.
Because you feel alone. You're like, especially when you're divorced, like your wife leaves you and you're like, well, shoot, like the person who said they were going to love me forever is just like pieced out. So like I must suck pretty bad. But if you go to if you get with other guys that love you and guys that struggle in the same way you do, they're going to let you know like that's not actually the case. And that's how I met some guys that had been divorced. And so they were able to walk me through like, hey, my life's different now than it used to be. So just give me sort of a vision of the future of like, okay, I'm not always going to be this sad. That's good.
Yeah.
My family was good too. I had sort of drifted away from a lot of my family in the midst of all this marriage stuff because my wife at the time wanted me to be kind of separated. She didn't think they were giving me a lot of good advice, which in hindsight was not true. They were very helpful, but she was trying to separate me from them. So I reconnected with a lot of them, so that was good. I started being on time more for things, which was a weird thing. I started doing more prayer, more reading. I loved reading as a kid, and then I quit in college. And now I've gotten back into reading, like just something as simple as that, like reading either the Bible or other books, like just learning to fill my time with other things rather than just being on my phone scrolling Twitter. I also got off Twitter. I got off a bunch of social media, which was super important. I got off a bunch of that. So I did like a big media cleanse. I'm back on social media now in a pretty small capacity because after years, I'm like, okay, I think I can handle it.
Right. Yeah.
Another big thing I do, like music's my like thing I love to do outside of most of my life. So like I played in bands for forever and just love doing music. So I got back into doing a bunch of music in that year where I was kind of not doing very much. I didn't play a lot of music, which was really hard for me. And in hindsight, that would have really helped me recover faster, would have been to be with my friends who play music because art is really beautiful and God honoring. And so it would have been nice to make music with my friends who I was in bands with a bunch of other Christians. So it's not like I was hanging out with these guys like doing drugs and sleeping with hookers or whatever. Like it was like I was not like a rock star. We were just like, it was me and my buddies from college that had bands. So I got back into doing a bunch of that stuff, like the stuff that made me feel like me. So that was healthy. So gym, music, getting on time to things, going to groups. I started professional school, which really helped cram a lot of time because like professional school is hard and it takes a lot of your time. And that was good for me to like get zoned in there. So I assume most people have jobs. And so if you're struggling with this, like it's not a bad idea to work. Like work is good for us and helps us funnel ourselves into stuff. So those were kind of the main single guy things. And then it started transitioning as I got older. I met Helen and we ended up getting married. We were able to have these kind of conversations. So we went into marriage, like understanding, hey, I'm not a normal brain, I don't think. So how can we work with that? Getting married helped a lot. It helped me double down. Because I think particularly with addiction, like you want to fall back into your old things. And maybe I'm a weak enough man to be like, if it's just me and I'm the only person I'm hurting, like I'm going to fall back into it. Because it's just, I don't know. I think I'm so used to sinning after all these years that it's like you're a little numb to it. Like it should hurt me more, but it just doesn't all the time. Yeah. And that's just a weird part of being an addict and struggling with just having it happen so often. When you get married to somebody, it's like, well, I definitely know it hurts Helen. So that has helped me. It's like I really love her and don't want to hurt her. Yeah. So that's been really helpful as a married guy and like finding people like that to kind of structure your life around. And now that I have kids, it's like I also don't want to hurt my kids. Like I want to be clean because my kids deserve a dad who's clean. Like they don't. And I've heard some friends of mine that are alcoholics, like they talk about that the same way. It's like I don't want to drink because my kids deserve to not have an alcoholic dad. I'm like, that's good. I should think the same way. Like my kids don't deserve to have a porn addicted dad. Because that, like, I'm not going to love my daughter well because my idea of what makes a woman is going to be all off. And I'm definitely not going to love my son well who's coming. Like, I'm not going to be able to teach him anything about how to be a man if I'm like, hey, I can't even control my urge to, like, look at women. Like, that's not a very good example to set, and I don't want to do that. So, it's changed more. Like, I'd go to the gym less because I have less time, and I've transitioned from being in school to going to work. But still, like, being in a church community and being with people, that has not changed. I still play music as much as I can. So those are like the little things that make me me. I still try to do, but it's changed a little bit from like activities I'm doing to fill my time to now more the people I'm around. But they are both equally as effective as far as like replacing addiction. Because again, you're totally right. And that's a key thing as far as recovery from addiction is that you don't just cold turkey and like leave an empty space in your heart where that used to be. You've got to fill it with things. Obviously, the ideal Christian thing is like we fill it with Jesus, but what does that even mean? It's like you have to fill it with activities that are honoring and good. Like I think God gets honor from me going and working on my body. Not obsessively or sinfully, but like going and lifting a weight is better than going home and watching porn.
Yeah.
And so you're filling that and honoring Jesus in that way.
Yeah.
I think that's what that means. But as Christians, we always say, oh, you fill it with Jesus, but it's practical too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took months to years for me to really make hardcore changes, like make them feel solid enough that's like, okay, I'm a different person now. And that was with meeting with like a couple nights a week, I would go to different things, do it every single week, all year, couple years. And then it's like, okay, cool. I think about things differently than I used to.
Yeah.
So it does take time.
Yeah. So you have a kid now, and I know beforehand, I think what your mindset was kind of like iffy about kids, but you've had a kid, and like I can tell, like it just like radiates so much joy from you when Lois is around. Like I kind of want to talk about like. I know what the answer is going to be to this, but like, was it worth it? Like, as a man, was it worth it to go into that? How has having a kid like changed your perspective and mindset on like your whole entire life, and like what has that done for you in like the terms of like the purpose and fulfillment in your life?
So I'm gonna look at the camera. Get married and have children. It's like the best thing you can do for your desire to have goals for your life. That being said, it's not the thing for everyone. Not everyone is called to marriage. Not everyone is called to have kids. But I think the average person usually is. And it's super essential because we as human beings are incredibly selfish, and our minds will often float back to ourselves at all times. And one of the biggest ways you can temper your selfishness and temper that desire to only think about yourself all the time is to begin to spread yourself thin. So you do that first by getting married. Like, hey, I'm now becoming one with another human being, so I've got to start thinking about them all the time. But sometimes that's not necessarily difficult because they're a functioning adult. And so they can feed themselves and they don't go to the bathroom on themselves, and they're pretty cool and they don't scream a lot at you. Hopefully, if your marriage is good, you don't get screamed at. Continuing to stretch yourself thin and continuing to be like, what does it look like to serve people like Christ did, who took off everything and became man? Like he went from God to man. So how can I continue to serve the people around me? And like, how can I learn what that looks like? Is to have a child who's this little bitty baby who can't do anything. It's going to stretch you a ton. Like I had a really good friend of mine who said, he was like, you as a dad, there's going to be some time where you're just insanely mad at this baby. He's like, what you got to do is just put the baby down, do whatever you got to do to get that anger out, and then just pick him back up. Because you can't be mad at the baby because it's a baby. They don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And for me, that happened. Lois was a couple weeks old, and we were walking. We had just moved in this house because we moved when she was really little. And I was walking. There's this long hallway that goes down the house, and we were walking. It was like 2 or 3 a.m., and she just wouldn't sleep. She would cry if I put her down, but she would be quiet if I walked with her. And so kind of the newborn stage, you're trying to let your wife sleep as much as possible because they just pushed a baby out there hurting. And you're like, okay, I didn't go through like a Herculean effort so I can walk. But after like an hour of walking, you're like, oh my God, I'm so tired. It's 3 a.m. I just want to go to bed. And Lois just wouldn't sleep. And it just like, I felt like I was going crazy. And so eventually I just put her down on the couch because I was just like, I was trying not to get mad at her because she just wouldn't sleep. This is a baby. So I put her down, and I was so like worked up that I just like got down on my knees and like slammed my hands on the ground, like was just prostrate on the ground, like, God, please let this baby sleep. And then I was like, oh, I took a couple breaths and I was like, okay, we're good. Picked her back up, started walking. She fell asleep like 15 minutes later. That's after a little more walking. And then I was able to put her down, and she slept for a little while, and everything was fine. But that, like, just that instant, like, it was good that I had friends who gave me that advice. But I also saw in that, like, how selfish am I to be mad at this like little baby who's just like trying to sleep.
Yeah.
It is super inconvenient for me that she doesn't want to sleep at 3 a.m.
Right.
But it's also so good to be able to watch her be a human being. Like, it's so cool. So I'm super dad pilled. So I tell all my friends that are single, or they're married, that have kids, I'm like, you should have kids. Obviously, it doesn't fit for everybody's lifestyle yet, and money and all those things. Like, don't have kids sillily or without proper forethought. But it's going to stretch you a lot, and being stretched is good. If the goal of our lives, like Heidelberg Catechism, the chief end of man is glorify God and enjoy him forever. If we're supposed to glorify God, he's going to continue to make us more like Christ. And if Christ was such a servant, we've got to learn how to be such a servant too. How can I serve the people around me? And having kids is a super great way to do that. I grew up not loving kids a ton. Like I thought baby stage, I thought I was going to hate it. I thought I was going to be like, I was going to love having teenagers as kids.
Yeah.
Because like, oh, once they're cool and I can talk to them about stuff. Like, let me show you this music and these movies and video games. I thought that was going to be my fun stage. I've loved parenting an infant and toddler like way more than I thought I would. Because even though they're messes and like they get sick and they snot and they cry, it's just like, man, this is so joyful to watch life. And it's like it's innocent little start when they're just little itty bitty babies running around and everything's fun and just learning how to say animal sounds. And it's like, I didn't think I could ever love something this minute. The smaller of scale my life has become, the more satisfied I've been. Like when I was younger and I was on the internet all the time and I thought I had to be all up to date on global politics and what's going on everywhere, I was like so stressed. And now that I just go to work and take care of people's animals and I come home and I watch my baby and I go to church, I'm like, this is awesome. Like this is this is great. I get why farmers 300 years ago were like, yeah, life's pretty good. Like I don't know what's going on down there 5 miles down the road, but I'm good here. We got food and water and a place to sleep.
Yeah.
I'm like, cool. Simple is good. Yeah, simple's good. There's somewhere in the New Testament, I'm blanking on where. It's one of the epistles, and the advice the epistle, like this section of verses is giving is like aim to live a simple life so that you can be at peace with the people around you. And I remember reading through that a couple months ago in a Bible study, and I was like, oh man, that hits way differently now that I'm living a relatively simple life to be at peace with the people around me. Like this is good advice. It's almost like the Bible knows what it's talking about.
Yeah, right.
I would recommend counseling for most folks that are struggling. Like it's good to either talk to a guy you know about it or like a pastor, because pastors are going to know, like, can get you set up with the right kinds of people. I've had some people who it's like they struggle with focusing on stuff, but if you're going and paying someone money to talk about your life, like hopefully you will use that effectively, because you're like, it's not just like, oh, I need to get better. It's also like, I need to get better and I'm paying money for this. So I should probably like use the service instead of just throwing my money down the toilet.
Yeah.
So
you kind of have an obligation to do it.
Yeah, that would be my thought at least.
Like, yeah.
I think an essential part of things to do is just putting barriers between yourself and your sin. And like, what I mean by that is some stuff to make it more difficult. Like if you study yourself, you'll realize I act out in certain ways at certain times. Most of us like to follow patterns. I was always an internet pornography user. I didn't do much else besides that. So for me, it was like, how can I put a barrier up? Like get a software. So I got Covenant Eyes, which I like pretty well. There is no perfect barrier. If you had a perfect one, that'd be great. But usually like behaviors are good to help change behavior, but also you can get around them if you want to. Putting up a barrier is just designed to give your, like, it's supposed to help give you time to also make that heart change. But barriers are helpful. So like I put up a thing that tracks where I go and sends reports to people so that in case I stumble, folks can check in. Like when I talked about getting off social media, like I didn't just get off it like, oh, I'm just not going to get on it. Like I had to block it from my from my website, like where it's like you search on Safari, like if you try to go to Facebook, it's like you can't access this website because like I went and put it on a list. Yeah. And then I would give the passcode to change that list to a buddy, like my friend that I was talking about, who's my best friend. Like I gave him that list and I was like, do not let me change these things until like we sit down and have a conversation a year from now where I'm like, hey, I feel comfortable going back on those things. He was like, cool. All right. So that's that. So like you change these things about your life to give your brain time to reset. Because it's like, now I can look at Facebook and not be like, oh, cool, I want to go look for something like to act out with. Right. Now I can just be like, haha, funny minion meme that my mom shares. Like those are great. Yeah. But for a while I couldn't do that. And it's tough too. Like one of my hardest things about being an addict is that I want to be normal and I want to be the kind of guy that can handle stuff. And sometimes I'm just not. And that's okay. You got to have grace for yourself in that. Like sometimes there's a movie that's like, that might be a really good movie, but it's got a lot of sexual content. So like, it ain't for me. Yeah. Even though I want it to be for me because it's a good movie. Right. Sometimes social media is like that for me. Like my algorithm knows what I like and sometimes it wants to put too much in front of that. So like sometimes I just need not. I just need to not be on it for a while. So that's good. Just training to not do that and putting up barriers like that, like being able to lock yourself out of websites and things like that. Trying to think what else. Yeah, that's the last thing I was thinking of. Barriers are important. I wanted to finish by reading Psalm 32. When I was in the middle of recovery, an elder at my church who had struggled in the same way as me, we met a number of times and he was very helpful. He introduced me to this psalm and I have gone back to it many a times over the years because I feel like it's very important and good. So I wanted to read that. I got my Bible over here. The title is Blessed are the forgiven in my ESV Bible, which is a good place to start as someone who is coming out of sin. And for anyone who comes out of sin, I would recommend you read this psalm because it's important. It's a good reminder that being forgiven is good. Yeah, I'll read it. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven and whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgression to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Therefore let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach you. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with shouts of deliverance. I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Be not like a horse or a mule without understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it will not stay near you. Many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts the Lord. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O you righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. So
That's awesome.
If I could summarize my life, it's that psalm. Like, I hid. It was awful. I finally was like, I'm going to take responsibility for my life. And God forgives you. There is forgiveness for anything. Doesn't matter what you've done. If you don't feel like you have anyone that cares in your life, feel free to reach out to me, because I've probably got a story of doing something worse, and would be happy to help you understand that there is forgiveness for what you've done. And in the same way, like, we're not supposed to be like a horse or a mule. Like, if our urges are uncontrolled, we're just animals. And striving for something better than that that's a worthy purpose in life.